I sat on the edge of the couch, still in my black funeral dress, when I heard him say it. Finally, we can sell her off too. He was in the kitchen, my son, speaking like I was furniture, not family. My teacup trembled in its saucer, but I said nothing. After 49 years of marriage, after sacrificing my name, my sleep, my youth, after giving birth to the man now making deals over my body, I said nothing. Not until the notary read the name on. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The clink of glass sounded louder than it should have. Maybe because the house was too quiet now, save for muffled condolences and the slow shuffling of feet over the old Dalton carpet, the kind no one made anymore. Maggie stood in the dining room doorway, hands folded neatly in front of her, nodding politely to someone she didn't recognize. Black coats and shallow hugs. From the living room, she heard Brian's, too casual for the day his father was buried. Finally, he said, like the word tasted good in his mouth, we can sell her off too. There was a pause. Then Tina's laugh, sharp, short, amused, like a dog barking at something. A fork dropped on Holly. Maggie didn't need to look. She knew the sound of her granddaughter's nervous flinch. The girl wouldn't say anything. Not here. Not now. Maggie's breath stayed even, but a muscle near her jaw she blinked slowly, the kind of blink you do when your whole body wants, but you don't give it the satisfaction. In the reflection of the glass cabinet, she caught sight of her neighbor Martha lingering near the hallway, sipping decaf. Their eyes met for a Martha moved closer, voice low and firm. Don't let them push you, Maggie. Maggie's lips barely moved. They already are. A smile fluttered across Martha's mouth. More sadness than amusement. She gave Maggie's hand a gentle squeeze before moving on, blending back into the soft hum of morning and Midwestern politeness. Maggie walked away quietly, slipping into the den, the one room no one else had entered all day. She closed the door softly behind her and crossed to the old secretary, Walnut, still smelling faintly of lemon oil and her husband's after. She pulled open the top drawer and took out her small leather-bound ledger, the one she'd always kept for budgets and birthdays. She flipped past pages of old grocery, tax calculations, and forgotten recipes, found a blank sheet. In her tight accountant's script, she wrote, "They think I'm merchandise." She stared at it then underlined, "Once." A noise outside, the front door closing too hard. Tina's voice floated in from the hallway. Honestly, she doesn't even need all this space. It's selfish. Brian, Dad should have handled this better. He was too soft on her. Holly, a beat later, she just buried her husband. Brian cold. Yeah. Which means she's not thinking. We have to act now. Maggie set the pen down, stood. The grief hadn't hit her yet. Not the way people talked about. The kind with sobbing and collapsed knees. Hers came like frost, silent and hard. Not from the loss of her husband, no. That wound was sacred, untouched. This was something else. This was insult layered on pain. She walked to the far wall where his wedding portrait still hung. Him in that ridiculous powder blue tuxedo, grinning like he'd just stolen something precious and couldn't believe his luck. She reached out and touched the frame, then lowered her head. "Richard," she whispered. "You knew, didn't you?" Another laugh from the other room. Tina again, probably drinking wine like it was a reward for surviving the funeral. Maggie returned to the desk, slipped the ledger into her handbag, and straightened her spine. She wasn't confused. She wasn't weak. She wasn't going to be pushed. Her fingers brushed the edge of an envelope inside the drawer, sealed, with her name on it. She didn't open it yet. She just placed it into her bag next to the ledger, as if she already knew it would matter later. Behind the door, footsteps. She stepped out into the hallway just as Brian rounded the corner. "Oh, Mom." He feigned surprise, half a smirk curling. She looked him in the eye, calm, calculated. "I was just saying," he said quickly. "We should talk soon about the house, you know. Make things easier on you." Maggie nodded. "Of course. Soon." Brian looked relieved. "Okay. Good. But not today," she added, voice silk over. "Today's for the dead." Then she walked past him, out into the late afternoon light filtering through the screen door, where Martha waited on the porch with a knowing look, and Holly sat on the steps, pretending to scroll her phone but blinking too fast. Maggie sat down beside her granddaughter. "You okay?" Holly asked, without looking. Maggie didn't answer. Instead, she opened her bag and quietly pulled the ledger back out. She opened to the page and wrote one more line beneath her last. "Let's begin." The notary's office was cold in the way government spaces often were. Function over comfort. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. casting a pale, unforgiving glow over metal file cabinets and wall calendars with real estate ads pinned below them. The place smelled faintly of toner, cheap coffee, and time gone stale. Maggie sat still on the cracked leather handbag on her lap, fingers resting atop it like she was guarding something. Her coat was neatly folded over her knees, her expression unreadable. James Harper, Notary Public, middle-aged and mild-looking, adjusted his glasses and pulled out a manila envelope Brian had shoved toward him with eager hand. "So," Brian said, his voice too loud for the room, "we just need to get the deed signed, transfer of ownership, keep things moving." His tie was loose, the collar of his dress shirt wrinkled from stress or carelessness, probably both. Tina sat beside him, legs crossed, scrolling her phone with the casualness of someone already counting the money. James cleared his throat and glanced at Maggie. "Mrs. Dalton, do you understand what's being requested here?" Maggie nodded slowly. "I understand he wants something." Brian scoffed. "Mom, come on. We talked about—" "No," she said, not moving. "You talked." I listened. James hesitated, then opened the envelope and pulled out the document. A long packet. Property transfer forms, disclaimer, title reassignment, legal language piled over legal language, dense as a wind. Maggie leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning. "May I review these?" she asked, her voice soft but crisp. Brian exhaled loudly. "We don't have to turn this into a courtroom, Mom," I said. She repeated, "May I review these?" James nodded, sliding the packet toward her. "Of course." Maggie slipped on her glasses. Her fingers moved with the steady, methodical ease of someone who had balanced numbers most of her life. She read, turned a page, read again. By page 4, she stopped. There, in the signature line, her name, typed neatly, pre-filled. She stared at it for a moment, as if it had personally insulted her. Then she flipped through the rest. Each page told the same story. Her name already there, like a placeholder, like a formality. Brian leaned forward. "Look, we're just trying to take the stress off your plate, sell the place, split the equity. You could get something smaller, nicer." Tina chimed in, not looking up from her phone. "Somewhere without all these stairs." Maggie turned one more page, blank date, blank witness line, but her signature line already waiting for her, like a grave with the headstone pre-carved. She looked up at James Harper, and something in her eyes made him sit straighter. "Mr. Harper," she said quietly, "do you always prepare documents with unsigned pre-filled names?" He blinked. "Sometimes parties provide them filled. Was this one of those times?" He glanced at Brian, then back at her. "May I speak with you for a moment, Mrs. Dalton?" Brian threw up his hand. "Jesus, what now?" James ignored him and rose, gesturing to the hallway just outside the glass-paneled door. Maggie followed. She walked slowly, deliberately, like someone balancing a glass of water on. Once in the hall, James shut the door gently and lowered his voice. "Off the record, you don't have to sign anything today. No pressure. If you need counsel." She opened her purse, pulled out the leather ledger, flipped to the fresh page. "They think I'm merchandise. Let's begin." She didn't let him read it long, just long enough. Then she closed it and said, "This wasn't typed by me? Or, with my knowledge?" James nodded. He reached into his blazer and slipped her a business card with quiet efficiency. No smile, just a small nod. "Should you need it." Maggie tucked the card between the ledger pages and looked through the office window. Brian was slouched in the chair now, scrolling his own phone, looking irritated. Tina hadn't looked up at all. They were both already acting like the house was sold, and they were shopping online for what to do next. Maggie turned back to James. "Not today," she whispered. The bank lobby was too quiet for a Friday. Carpet muted every step, and even the ticking wall clock seemed to be holding its breath. Maggie stood at the counter, her ID in one hand, the small brass key in the other. It had lived in her sewing drawer 3 decades, untouched. Her husband had told her, only once, what it opened. "In case I'm not around," he'd said with a half smile, as if that was a joke he had permitted. Now, he wasn't around. The young teller looked at the key, checked her screen, then nodded politely. "You're all set, Mrs. Dalton? Down the hall, second vault. You'll have privacy." Maggie gave a tight smile, her eyes unreadable behind rimless glasses. She walked with the same deliberate calm she wore at the funeral, shoulders set, steps measured as if each tile mattered. Inside the vault room, cold air coiled around her ankle. Metal boxes lined the walls, numbered and identical, save for the years of smudges and fingerprints around their locks. She found the right one, inserted the key. It opened with a soft, mechanical click. Inside, a simple, black envelope, thick, sealed, labeled in her husband's slanted handwriting, M. Dalton, personal. Beneath it, a folded legal document, heavy paper, the seal visible before she even lifted it. She opened the envelope first, a single sheet, typed, with a sticky note in his handwriting clipped to the top. Maggie, if you're reading this, it means what I feared came true. You've always been the quiet protector of this family. Now it's my turn. Trust no one but what you can. Numbers never lie. Neither did Richard. Her throat tightened. She sat on the small metal bench along the wall, smoothing the document with careful last will and testament of Richard E. Dalton, notarized, updated 5 months ago. And not a whisper of it ever shared. She read it twice. He'd left everything, the house, the land, the accounts, solely to Brian's name was mentioned only once, in a clause explicitly stating that he was not to receive any property or financial distribution due to long-standing unreliability and patterns of debt. Attached was a secondary file, a personal memo, sealed separately, labeled for Maggie's eyes only. She opened it and read in silence: credit card statements, casino withdrawals, a second mortgage Richard had secretly refinanced, paid off with his pension to protect the house from seizure. He hadn't told her, not out of shame, but strategy. He knew if he died first, Brian would move fast. A knock at the vault door startled her. It opened gently. Holly stood there, backpack over one shoulder, face flushed from the September sun. "You okay?" she asked, voice low. Maggie didn't speak. She held up the will. Holly stepped in, took it, scanning the lines quickly. Her jaw clenched. "They're gonna lose it. They think it's about winning." Maggie murmured. "It's not. It's about math." Holly set the document down and pulled out her phone. "Let's scan everything." "Not here. Not yet. But if something happened." Maggie looked at her, calm, unshaken. "Holly, we're not rushing. We're documenting." They photographed each page, Maggie studying the corners while Holly worked in silence. No tears, no theatric, just a quiet rhythm of clicks and shadows moving across paper. After the last scan, Holly lowered the phone. "Did Grandpa know about how bad Dad's finances were?" Maggie folded the documents neatly. "He knew everything. He just didn't say it out loud." She slid the original back into the envelope, resealed the vault, and locked it. As they walked back into the corridor, Holly hesitated. "So, what now?" Maggie adjusted her bag strap. "Now," she said, "we account for everything." They stepped into the lobby again, past the potted ficus and outdated financial brochures. Outside, the wind picked cooler, like the season finally remembered it was turning. Before they reached the parking lot, Maggie paused and looked at the bank's reflection in the glass door. She could see her own face beside Holly's, like two generations lined up in quiet. Under her breath, just loud enough for Holly to hear, she whispered, "He prepared for this." The slam of the front door rattled the stained glass panel above it. Maggie didn't flinch. She was seated at the dining table, ledger open, coffee cooling beside. It was still morning, barely. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, striping the room in angled light. She had already made notes, labeled file, documented the lockbox's content. There was nothing left to do now but wait. The wait ended with Brian's voice, sharp and echoing down the hall. "You need to stop playing games, Mom." He stormed into the room, red in the face, holding a packet of papers in one hand like it was a weapon. Tina followed 2 steps behind, arms crossed, face smirking like she knew a secret no one else did. "You know what this is?" Brian dropped the packet onto the table in front of her. Pages slid out, half-folded, already crumpling at the corners. "A copy," Maggie said calmly, "of something I'm not signing." Brian laughed, a dry, mean sound. "You think this is a joke?" "No," she replied. "I think it's a mistake." Tina rolled her eyes. "We can't afford to let her stall this. If we wait, the probate process gets expensive. She doesn't even need the house. We should be helping her, not letting her rot in." Brian's hand slammed the table, jolting the coffee cup. "You either sign or we start the legal route. We'll get a judge to declare you unfit to manage property. You've got no income. You're over 70. The house is too much." Upstairs, a creak of movement. Maggie didn't look up. She knew Holly had arrived early and let herself in, probably heard everything. Tina leaned in. "We've already toured facilities. One has a koi pond." That drew Maggie's eyes, slow and focused. "How generous." Brian stepped closer. "You really want to drag this through court?" "No," she said, "but I will if I have to." She could feel it, the heat of the moment pressing in, but she stayed still, spine straight. Her husband used to say she had the calm of an accountant and the memory of a prosecutor, and in this moment, both were alive in her. Behind them, the hallway camera on the entry table blinked red, recording. What Brian didn't know was that Holly had tucked her phone into the pocket of Maggie's robe earlier that morning, screen down, voice memo running. Tina scoffed. "We're not being cruel. We're being realistic." Maggie folded the ledger closed. "What you are," she said, "is reckless." Brian's jaw clenched. "You think some notebook and a dusty will is gonna hold up in probate?" "I think," Maggie said quietly, "your father understood you better than you ever realized." For a flicker of a second, Brian's confidence cracked. He glanced at Tina, who gave a shrug, like it was her name on nothing and she was already halfway out of this mess. Then he turned and pointed a finger at Maggie, his voice rising. "You're going to lose. You won't last in court. Not with your health. Not with your age. People will believe me." Maggie didn't believe. "Then I suppose," she said, reaching for her phone, "it's time I spoke to someone who actually understands how courts work." She stood, calm and deliberate, and stepped into the living room. Brian followed but halted when she picked up the handset from the side table and dialed with a precision that made it clear. This wasn't a bluff. "Daniel?" she said when the line connected. "It's Margaret Dalton." "Yes, it's time." She paused, her gaze never leaving Brian. Then, with a voice low but anchored in something steel cord, she added, "I'd like to initiate probate count. There may be a challenge. I'd prefer to stay ahead of it." Brian opened his mouth, but no words came. Maggie ended the call, set the phone down, and turned back toward the hallway, where Holly now stood silently, her phone already in hand, still recording. Brian's voice dropped to a mutter. "You won't last court." Maggie stepped past him, barely glancing his way. "We'll see who lasts," she said. The office of Daniel Rhodes was nothing like Brian would have imagined. No sleek downtown tower, no aggressive legal decor. Just a quiet brick building off Reading Road, with a second-floor suite that smelled faintly of paper and pine clean. But to Maggie, it felt like a war room. She sat beside Holly on a leather love seat, her hands folded over her purse. The envelope containing Richard's will and personal memo rested on the small coffee table. Loaded weapon, quiet, inert, until Daniel Rhodes stood at the far end of the room, speaking to someone over speakerphone. His tone was calm but sharp, like a scalpel. "Yes," he said. "We have the client's signed authorization. Proceed with the account audit. Pull anything from the last 18 months tied to Margaret Dalton's name, joint or otherwise." A clipped voice from the other end replied, "Understood. Initial results by tomorrow. Video request already submitted to branch manager." The call ended with a polite click. Rhodes turned toward them, removing his glasses and sitting on the edge of his desk. "You were right to call when you. This goes deeper than just in." Maggie didn't speak. She reached into her purse and handed him the letter. Richard's final words? The ones she hadn't shared with anyone else yet. Rhodes unfolded it slowly. He read it once, then again. His brow tightened. "He knew about the refinancing," Maggie said softly, "and he knew Brian would come after the house." Rhodes nodded once, "Which is why he set protections in place." He looked up at her, voice lower now. "And why I believe your son panicked the moment he realized the will wasn't in his favor." From his desk drawer, Rhodes pulled out a slim folder. He opened it, revealing scanned copies of 3 canceled checks, all made out to cash. He explained, sliding the top page forward, "Signed in your name." Maggie leaned forward, examining the loops, the spacing. "That's not my signature," she said without hesitation. Holly stood, moved beside her, looking over her shoulder. "You've never signed like. Even I know that." Rhodes nodded. "We already suspected as much. What confirmed it was the ATM camera footage. Your bank's manager sent me 2 stills." He turned his monitor to face them. On screen, a blurry image of Brian, hunched slightly, at the drive-up ATM, depositing a check. Another image, this one clearer. The check being fed into the machine. The endorsement on the back read, "Margaret E. Dalton." Maggie stared at it, then sat back, spine straightening inch by inch. "He used my name to cash in before I even had time to grieve," she said quietly. Rhodes didn't offer sympathy. What he gave instead was precision. "We have enough for a financial fraud inquiry," he said. "Forgery, misrepresentation, possible exploitation of a vulnerable adult, though that part may not hold. You're sharp. But the rest? It's actionable." A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Lisa Carver stepped in, mid-40s, plain blazer, calm eyes, and a voice like a worn tape measure, exact and unbothered. "Mrs. Dalton?" she said, nodding politely. "Mr. Rhodes filled me in. If you're ready, we can begin the formal statement process. Maggie rose to her feet. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't hesitating. She was, for the first time in weeks, centered. Do you need anything to start? Carver asked. Maggie opened the envelope again, pulled out the will, the memo, and the bank scan. Just these, she said. As Rhodes began organizing copies for evidence, Holly stepped close, her voice low but urgent. Grandma, we can win this. Maggie's hand paused on the ledger in her lap. She looked at her granddaughter, not with hope, but with something cooler, more exact. This isn't about winning, she whispered. It's about proving. Rhodes looked up. He's cornered himself, Maggie. It's only a matter of time now. Outside the window, the wind rattled the trees, early fall beginning to loosen summer's grip. Inside the office, the air had shifted. Not in Maggie, in her control. The courtroom was wood-paneled and cold, but Maggie sat with the same posture she had in Rhodes's office, upright, patient, and unshakably still. Her handbag rested on her lap. The binder, black faux leather, zippered, neatly tabbed, looked like it belonged to a corporate accountant, not a widow, but it belonged to both. Judge Evelyn Marks presided from the bench like she'd seen 1,000 families pretend to get along until inheritance was on the line. She wore her robe like armor, glasses perched low as she scanned the docket. This is case number 22P803, Dalton Estate, motion to contest sole inheritance, the clerk announced. Brian sat across the aisle, hair combed, ties straightened, but his eyes flickered constantly. He looked to Tina for silent reassurance, but she was already leaning back in her chair, arms folded. Her confidence had thinned to a brittle smirk. Daniel Rhodes rose first. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the late Richard Dalton left a clear, legally binding will assigning his assets to his wife. We will also present evidence of financial misconduct on the part of the contestant, Mr. Dalton's son. Judge Marks didn't blink. Proceed. Brian shot to his feet, waving a folder like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. Your Honor, with all due respect, my mother is not well. She's grieving, she's isolated, and she's become confused about what was intended. We're simply trying to protect her and carry out what my father would have wanted. Maggie didn't move. Rhodes stepped forward calmly. We have a notarized will, updated, dated 5 months prior to Mr. Dalton's death. No signs of coercion. We've also obtained a medical evaluation from Dr. Harris, who certified Mrs. Dalton's full mental competence within the last 2 weeks. Clean bill of cognitive health. He handed up the document. Judge Marks, eyes narrowing as she read. Rhodes can. Furthermore, will show that Mr. Dalton, he nodded toward Brian, engaged in financial activity in mother's name, forged checks, ATM footage. These were not isolated mistakes. This was deliberate. Brian's mouth opened, but the judge raised a single hand. Mr. Dalton, you'll speak when spoken to. Maggie turned one page in her binder, quietly, methodically. Detective Carver? Rhodes called. Lisa Carver stood and made her way to the witness. No frills, just a badge and a voice made for deposition. Detective, what did your investigation reveal? Rhodes asked. Carver, flipping through a thin case file, responded evenly. We obtained footage from Hamilton Community Bank showing the defendant depositing multiple checks made out to cash, endorsed in Mrs. Dalton's name. Signature analysis confirmed forgery. The amounts totaled nearly $19,000 over 6 weeks. Gasps from the gallery. Judge Marks raised an eyebrow. Is that confirmed? Yes, ma'am, Carver replied. Bank verified it. We have documentation. Brian shot up again. That money was for Mr. Dalton, the judge snapped. Another interruption and you'll be held in contempt. He dropped back into his chair, face flushed. Rhodes offered no gloating. He simply returned to the table and sat. Tina leaned toward Brian, whispering through clenched. You told me that account was closed. Judge Marks peered over her glasses at Maggie for the first time that morning. Mrs. Dalton, would you like to speak? Maggie looked up. No, Your Honor. Everything I needed to say is in the binder. She closed it gently, clicked the zipper. Marks nodded slowly. You're methodical. I like that. Reminds me of my mother. Maggie gave the faintest smile. We kept the same budget notebook for 37 years. The judge paused, then addressed the room. We will recess until next week. The court will review the will, the medical record, and law enforcement. But I'll tell you this much. She looked directly at Brian. You better hope your signature matches more than your father's disappointment. Maggie stood, collected her bag, and turned toward the exit. Holly waited just outside the doors. You didn't say a word, she whispered. I didn't need to, Maggie replied. The numbers said everything. The phone buzzed on Maggie's kitchen counter, the persistent hum cutting through the silence. She glanced at it but didn't pick it yet. The audit report from Rhodes had arrived, and she wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't shaking. There was no rush. Just another page in a ledger that had been years in the making. Holly stepped into the room quietly, glancing at the report on the counter. She paused, then pulled out a chair at the table and sat down. "It's a lot," she said, her voice hushed, careful. Maggie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up the phone and unlocked it. The report was waiting, along with an email from Daniel Rhodes. It wasn't long, just a few attachments, but enough to crack open Brian's world. She opened the first document. Forensic Audit Report. Brian Dalton. The first line was enough to make Maggie's chest tight. Massive gambling losses. $457,000 in 12 months. She read the detail. Losses from casinos, high-stakes poker games, and a marked pattern of late-night withdrawals. There were wires to offshore accounts, cash advances, and transactions that never seemed to add up. The document detailed how Brian had been living on borrowed time for months, trying to patch up a crumbling financial. But it wasn't just Brian. The next attachment. Mortgage arrears. Delinquent. Maggie's eyes scanned the figures, each one a reminder of a house she'd lived in for decades, one that Brian had tried to steal under the guise of care. $42,000 in missed mortgage and an additional $18,000 in penalty. Tina's name appeared too, buried deep in the paper. Joint account hold, multiple unsecured loans. "I knew he was bad with money," Holly said softly, watching Maggie's face. "But this..." Maggie nodded, still not speaking. Her gaze never left the screen. "It's more than bad. It's a pattern." Rhodes had already outlined Brian's strategy. He had tried to manipulate the situation, desperate, but calculated. Claiming the house, selling it, getting a quick payout to fix debts he never planned to face. That was the plan all along. But Rhodes didn't stop there. The next email came. Tina Dalton's spending analysis. Maggie opened it slowly. The report listed Tina's shopping house, high-end boutique, multiple credit card charges to online luxury stores, clothing, jewelry, electronics. The amounts were staggering. Tina had been siphoning off money too, using the account linked to Maggie's name to cover her habit, hiding it under the pretense of family. The same money Brian had been using to line his gambling debts. Maggie took in the numbers, careful, meticulous. This wasn't about emotion. This wasn't about what they'd done. It was about how they had done it, and how they would be held accountable. She paused at the last email. Rhodes's summary of the civil claim. The documents, already drafted, would reinforce the fraud charges. "We'll make a case," he'd written. "We'll go after everything. There's no running from this." Holly exhaled sharply. "So it's really happening?" Maggie closed the phone, setting it back down on the counter. The room was still. Her breathing was steady. But there was an edge to the silence, one that hadn't been there before. A shift. "We don't win," Maggie whispered, glancing over at Holly. "We prove." Holly's eyes met hers, a mixture of pride and fear. "It's going to be a war, Grandma." "Yes," Maggie said quietly, but her voice was more certain than it had been in weeks. "It's going to be a war. But one where the truth doesn't get buried under lies." Holly stood and walked over to her, resting a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "We'll fight. All the way." Maggie stood up, looking out the window where the last of the morning fog was burning off. The sun cut through the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house, still quiet and familiar, had become a battleground, but it was hers. No one was taking it. Her fingers brushed the edge of the binder as if the pages themselves would offer more strength. "Numbers never lie," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The sun had just begun its, casting long shadows across the front of the house as Maggie stood by the mailbox, sorting through the usual stack of bills. The air had a crispness to it now, the kind that reminded her of change, the kind that made her feel more alive than she had in months. A car engine revved from behind. Maggie didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Brian's car screeched to a halt by the curb, tires scuffing against the pavement. The door slammed open before the engine had even stopped. Maggie straightened, watching him approach, the weight of the situation pressing in her chest. She wasn't surprised. She had known this moment would. Brian stormed toward her, his eyes burning with that familiar, ugly frustration. He had never understood how to control his rage. "Listen, you old witch," he spat, stepping too close, his voice low but seething. "You're making this harder than it has to be. You think you can win this? You think those lies and that stupid notebook are going to hold up in court?" Maggie didn't flinch, didn't back away. She held her ground, the same steady presence that had carried her through the worst of their years. "I'm not going to sign Brian," she said, her voice calm and precise. "Not now. Not ever." He grabbed her arm, hard enough that she felt it, but not enough to make her stumble. His face twisted with rage, and for a moment Maggie saw it. The desperation, the panic that came from knowing he was losing control of everything he thought he could command. "You don't have a choice," he snarled. "I'll make you regret this. You will sign that paper, or I'll make sure everyone sees just how out of it you really are." Maggie stood frozen for a moment, but not out of fear. She was calculating, measuring the weight of his threat and how he could make it work in his favor. But there was something in her that understood he couldn't make it work. Not anymore. Not with what she had. The moment stretched. Time hung heavy between them. And then, Holly's voice came from behind. "I'm recording this." Maggie didn't need to look back. She knew Holly was standing a few feet away, phone in hand, capturing every word, every move. Brian didn't even turn. He was too consumed by the fire that was burning in. "You're insane, you know that," Brian shouted, as though expecting the whole street to hear. "You think they'll believe you? An old woman with a stupid notebook and your broken mind? You're going to make a fool of yourself, and I'm going to make sure of it." Maggie remained quiet, standing tall. She could feel the heat of his words, but she wasn't burning with them. Instead, she was collecting them, letting them fall into the right place. He was digging his own hole. "I'm going to ruin you," he hissed. "I'll make sure you're nothing." There was a pause, a sharp inhale from Brian as he stepped back, glaring at her. He turned abruptly, stalking back to his car. The tires squealed again as he sped off, leaving nothing but a trail of anger and desperation in his wake. Maggie remained in place, unmoving. Holly stepped forward, lowering her phone. "Grandma, are you okay?" Maggie nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she watched Brian's car disappear down. Her hand was still where he'd grabbed her arm, but there was no bruise, just the reminder of his threat. "I'm fine," Maggie said softly, almost. "But he's wrong. This isn't about breaking me. It's about breaking him." Her voice was calm, measured. As they stood there in the dimming light, a knock sounded from the door. Maggie turned, already knowing who it was. Daniel Rhodes stood at the threshold, a file in his hand, and a look of concern on his face. He'd been waiting for this. He stepped in, without a word, and nodded toward the phone still clutched in Holly's hand. "I heard the whole thing." "I know," Maggie replied, still calm. "What happens next?" Rhodes set the file on the table. "We're filing a restraining order. We'll have evidence for the court hearing. This time, it's not just words, it's action." Maggie picked up the file, her fingers resting on the edge. She didn't open it yet, but she knew exactly what it contained. The proof she had been gathering, the tools to finish this fight. She looked up at Rhodes, and then at Holly. "Stress doesn't kill me," she whispered, her voice low but unshakable. "Lies do." The headline hit harder than the courtroom drama. "Dalton family feud. Mother takes stand. Son faces fraud charges." Maggie read it over breakfast, the ink of the paper still fresh and sharp under the morning light. The image on the front page was a picture of her standing stoically outside the courthouse, her back straight, her face calm as the press cameras clicked. It felt like a distant moment, so many emotions had passed her in the weeks. But this was the moment she realized the world was watching. The article detailed the entire saga. Brian's attempted fraud, the forged checks, the emotional manipulation, the systematic attempts to strip Maggie of everything she had built. But more than that, it focused on Maggie herself, her strength, her dignity, and the quiet defiance that had captivated the public. Across the kitchen, Holly leaned against the counter, watching her grandmother. Her eyes were wide, the corners of her mouth fighting back a smile. "It's everywhere," Holly said, voice low but filled with pride. "Even people at school are talking about you." Maggie didn't answer immediately. She folded the newspaper with careful hands, setting it aside. She knew how it would look to the world, how it would feel to everyone who had watched Brian's temper flare and his lies unravel. But she wasn't here for praise. She was here for proof. Brian's name was also splashed across the article, but it wasn't flattering. The public's sympathy had already begun to swing toward Maggie, and Brian had become the poster child for greed and desperation. His reckless threats had only deepened. A man willing to risk everything for money, using his own mother as a pawn in his financial game. Tina's name, however, was absent from the headline. That would change soon enough. "People are talking," Rhodes said when he called later that morning. "And not just the media. The bench is starting to lean toward you. Public opinion can be a powerful thing." Maggie didn't respond right away. She stood, walking to the window, letting the sunlight fall across her face. Justice doesn't need applause, just proof, she whispered to herself. Rhodes's voice was warm on the other end of the line, acknowledging the quiet power of Maggie's. You've done more than just prove your point, Mag. You've exposed the truth. And now, it's going to stick. Outside, Maggie noticed the neighbors, those who had once averted their gaze, those who had murmured behind closed doors, were watching her now. No longer with pity, no longer with judgment. There was a new respect there. Tina's fury was evident the next time she'd seen the newspaper too, and it hadn't gone well. The woman's face was pinched, eyes narrow as she walked by Maggie's porch on her way to her car. You think you've won? Tina hissed, but there was nothing behind her words. No strength, no weight. She knew Maggie wasn't backing down. Maggie just smiled, thin-lipped. I don't need to win, Tina. I just need to prove the truth. The sound of Tina's heels clicking across the pavement was the last Maggie heard of her. Tina didn't even look back. It was then that Holly stepped up beside her. She reached out, taking her grandmother's hand. We've got this, Grandma. All the way. Maggie squeezed her hand, still quiet. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long while, the fog of uncertainty had lifted. The path ahead was clearer now, defined by actions, not words. That night, Rhodes called again. His tone had shifted. The court's filing for a permanent injunction, property protection. We're putting in a formal request to freeze any further action on the house. Maggie nodded, even though Rhodes couldn't see her. And Brian? The case is only getting stronger, he said. The fraud is undeniable. We've got enough for a grand jury. Good, Maggie replied, her voice steady as ever. Then we'll keep going. We'll prove every piece of it. Outside, the evening darkened, but Maggie didn't move. The weight of everything she had learned, everything she had endured, still pressed against her chest. But there was a new understanding there. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing for everything she'd built. And for the truth. As Holly tucked in beside her on the couch, Maggie whispered, "This is only the beginning." Maggie's hands were steady as she signed the final piece, a legal formality, but the significance of it wasn't lost on her. The house was officially protected. The court had ruled in her favor. The document, now sealed, ensured that Brian's efforts to sell the property would be halted. The air outside her house seemed different. A slight chill carried a sense of finality. A few weeks ago, she had been uncertain, but now, she felt an overwhelming clarity settle in her bones. The phone rang, interrupting the stillness. "Maggie," Daniel Rhodes said, his voice crisp with controlled energy. "The grand jury just handed down their decision. They've indicted Brian." The words settled over her like a wave. Indictment. It wasn't just a civil case anymore. It was criminal. And Brian's world was about to fall apart in a way he hadn't prepared for. He's been indicted on charges of elder fraud and financial exploitation. Tina has been named a co-conspirator. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing the cold surface of her coffee mug. She didn't feel the need to celebrate. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. But this was a moment she had long feared and longed for. "Good," she said quietly, her voice laced with resolve. "It's time he faced the consequence." The line was quiet for a moment. Then Rhodes spoke again, his tone softer but still firm. "There's more. The court's granting a motion for permanent property protection. We've locked everything down. The house, the assets, everything." Maggie's chest tightened with something close to satisfaction, but her eyes remained focused, scanning the quiet room around her. Everything she'd fought for was finally beginning to fall into place. The world had shifted, and now the truth had its full force behind it. "Are you ready for the next step?" Rhodes asked, always pragmatic. "I'm ready," Maggie said, with a finality that only someone who had walked this long road could understand. The next morning, Maggie stood in front of the courthouse once again, this time with Holly by her side. The air had a colder bite to it, but Maggie didn't feel it. She wasn't cold. She was focused, more so than ever. Holly looked up at her, a faint sense of awe in her expression. "Grandma, this is really happening." Maggie nodded, her eyes clear, her hand resting on Holly's shoulder. "We're not done yet," she said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." They walked into the courtroom, where the case was now no longer just about the house. It was about a man who had gone too far, exploiting his mother and breaking the law to feed his own group. Brian, once brash and confident, now sat in the defendant's chair, his eyes darting nervously. He had always been quick with a retort, but now there was nothing, just the cold reality of what was happening. He had no control anymore. Tina was absent. The indictment against her had shaken her to the core. She had tried to manipulate, tried to spin the narrative in her favor, but there was nothing left to hide behind. The truth had come for both of them. Maggie sat silently in the back of the courtroom, watching as the judge entered. Rhodes was up first, presenting evidence with the calm authority Maggie had grown to trust. Your Honor, Rhodes began, the indictment is the result of a long investigation into Mr. Dalton's financial the fraudulent checks, the misappropriation of funds, the emotional manipulation. This was not a case of poor decision, but of deliberate actions taken over months. His actions directly harmed his mother, and we ask that the full extent of his exploitation be recognized. Brian's defense attorney stood quickly, trying to play the sympathy. Your Honor, we request leniency. Mr. Dalton's actions were taken under stress, under duress. He was under financial pressure and… The judge cut him off, her voice sharp. Mr. Fee, Dalton's actions were deliberate. No amount of stress justifies what he has done. Maggie remained still, recording every detail in her. She wasn't shaken, not by the legal tactic, not by Brian's lies, not by Tina's act. She was watching the machine of justice grind forward, and she was no longer in its way. As the proceedings continued, Holly reached out and grasped her grandmother. Her fingers tightened, full of pride and quiet. Maggie looked down at their hand, and the weight of everything that had led them here seemed to lift for just a moment. I'm proud of you, Grandma, Holly whispered. Maggie didn't look up, but she squeezed Holly's hand back. We're not finished, she whispered, but the law owns him now. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with expectation. Brian's defense attorney, a sharp-suited man with slicked-back hair and a voice designed for persuasion, was doing what he did best, playing the crowd. Your Honor, he began, standing tall at the podium, what we have here is not a case of fraud or exploitation, but a simple family. My client, Mr. Brian Dalton, is a son who has watched his mother spiral into grief and confusion. His actions, though perhaps misguided, were done out of concern for her well-being. Maggie's fingers gripped the edge of the cool metal biting into her skin, but her face remained as unreadable as it had been throughout the trial. She didn't react, not to the accusation that she was spiraling, not to the soft, insidious insinuation that she was unstable. Brian's lawyer continued, turning to face the judge. This case is not about financial malfeasance. It's about a mother's inability to manage her own. Mr. Dalton had no choice but to act on her behalf. His motives were driven by family loyalty, by his concern for his mother's estate. Maggie didn't she didn't need to. The truth stood taller than any Across the courtroom, Rhodes rose with a steady grace. His presence was a sharp contrast to Brian's attorney, a quiet strength to their theatric. Your Honor, the defense would have us believe this is a simple case of a son trying to help his confused, vulnerable mother, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. But the facts tell a different story. Rhodes turned toward the jury, his gaze pierced. Let's start with the facts. He stepped forward, pointing to a large screen in the courtroom. Images flashed, graphs, bank statements, ATM footage. This timeline, Rhodes shows the clear pattern of fraudulent activity. Checks forged in Mrs. Dalton's name, withdrawals made without her knowledge, and none of this was out of concern for her health. No, Your Honor, this was a man trying to strip his mother's estate for his own gain. The defense attorney opened his mouth, but Rhodes was already moving forward, unwavering. You see, Your Honor, the true motive here was never about family. It was about money, and Mr. Dalton's attempt to manipulate his mother's finances, to silence her with emotional appeals, is what's at the heart of this. Brian's lawyer fumbled with his papers, glancing at his client, who now sat hunched in the defendant's chair, his face reddening with every word. I would also like to call Detective Lisa Carver to the stand, Rhodes said, his tone final. She will testify to the financial timeline that paints an undeniable picture of Mr. Dalton's actions. Carver's testimony was methodical, her voice firm and unyielding. After reviewing the financial record, she said, it was clear that Mr. Dalton was withdrawing large sums of money from his mother's account over a period of months. These were not emergency withdrawals or actions taken out of necessity. They were deliberate and planned. Brian's defense attorney shifted in his, trying to maintain his composure, but the case against Brian was building, each piece more damning than the last. Then, with quiet determination, Holly stood and walked to the witness. Maggie's heart swelled with pride as she watched her granddaughter sit tall, her eyes focused and Holly took a deep breath, her voice calm but unwavering. Can you tell the court what you know about your father's behavior regarding your grandmother's finances? Rhodes asked. Holly didn't hesitate. I've seen my dad take money from Grandma's accounts before. I never knew the full extent until all of this started, but I know that what he did was wrong, and I don't believe he was trying to help her. He was just trying to get what he wanted. Her words hit harder than any piece of evidence. Brian, once the manipulator, now found himself the manipulated, the son exposed by his own daughter. The defense attorney scrambled. Objection! The witness is biased. She's been... Judge Marks cut him off. Sustained. But I will allow the witness to finish. Holly's voice remained steady as she concluded. I don't think my dad ever had my grandmother's best interests at heart. He was only thinking about himself. The courtroom was silent for a moment, the weight of Holly's words settling over everyone. Maggie could feel the shift. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a reckoning. Judge Marks lowered her glasses and looked over at Brian's attorney. You may want to reconsider your approach, she said, her voice firm. These theatrics will not sway this court. Maggie sat back, her heart steady. She didn't need to speak anymore. The truth had spoken for her. Her gaze met Holly's across the room. She didn't need to say anything. They both knew. This was only the beginning. The trial had entered its most critical phase. The prosecutor stood with quiet authority, the weight of the case already sitting heavily on his shoulders. He addressed the jury directly, his voice measured and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case of exploitation, fraud, and manipulation, he began, the words sharp and deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. Over the last few months, the defendant, Brian Dalton, systematically forged checks, withdrew funds under false pretenses, and attempted to strip his mother of her rightful property. The gallery was silent. Every eye was fixed on the prosecutor, the gravity of the case pressing down on every word he spoke. Mr. Dalton's actions were not an accident, the prosecutor continued. They were deliberate, planned, and executed intention of defrauding a vulnerable woman, his own mother, who trusted him. The room shifted slightly as Maggie's gaze wandered over the faces of the jury. She couldn't read their expression, not all of them, anyway, but she felt the collective weight of their attention. Her heart remained steady. The prosecutor turned to face the screen behind him. We will show, with evidence, how Brian Dalton used his mother's name to cash in on funds that did not belong to him. This was not an innocent mistake. It was an act of theft, plain and simple. At his signal, a slideshow began. The first image was a close-up of the forged checks. The amounts were staggering, and the signatures undeniable. The room was still. Even Brian's defense attorney, once so quick to object and deflect, had fallen silent. His client's face, pale and flushed, betrayed him. The evidence you are about to see, the prosecutor continued, will show that Brian Dalton knew exactly what he was. Daniel Rhodes rose, and the shift in the courtroom was palpable. His calm, measured presence contrasted sharply with the earlier theatrics of the defense. He was the calm eye of the storm, and Maggie knew this was where the tide would turn. Your Honor, I now present the key pieces of evidence. Rhodes gestured to the large screen, where a new image appeared. The notary, the one Richard had kept safe in his lockbox, the will that left everything to Maggie. Rhodes let the document linger on the screen for a moment before speaking again. This is the will that was finalized 5 months before Mr. Dalton's death. There was no ambiguity. There was no confusion. Richard Dalton left his estate, his property, and his home to his wife, Margaret Dalton. The defense attorney made a sharp move in him, but Rhodes continued undeterred. This will was safely locked away, Rhodes added, moving toward the next piece of evidence. A video started to play on the screen, a grainy but undeniable recording from a local ATM. The footage showed Brian clearly at night, feeding checks into the machine and walking away with the cash. It was damning. Maggie remained still. Her eyes never wavered from the screen. She knew what came next. Detective Carver, please provide the jury with your testimony, Rhodes said, and Carver took her place on the stand with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout the investigation. Carver laid out the financial timeline, how Brian had systematically accessed funds, how checks had been cashed under Maggie's name without her knowledge. There was no confusion, Carver testified. This was fraud, plain and simple. Maggie's heart remained steady as she sat back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the edge of her binder. She hadn't looked at it, not yet. Next, it was Holly's turn. Rhodes had been preparing her for this moment for weeks. He had given her the space she needed to come forward, to speak her truth. Holly stood, her movements graceful, but her expression was determined. She walked to the stand without hesitation, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Holly," Rhodes began, his voice soft but firm, "can you tell the jury about the threats your father made toward your grandmother?" Holly's voice was steady, though the weight of her words hung in the air. "My dad, he used to threaten Grandma when she didn't do what he wanted. He said he'd make her life miserable if she didn't sign the paper. He said he'd take everything." Maggie felt a quiet pang in her chest, but her expression remained unshaken. Holly's bravery was not just for her grandmother, it was for the truth that needed to be heard. The jury leaned in slightly, their attention never wavering. The case was building, piece by piece, and the momentum was unmistakable. Tina, seated in the back, looked like she might crumble. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she tried to make herself smaller in the chair. She was no longer the confident figure of before. She was a woman cornered by her own lies. Maggie noticed her but didn't acknowledge her directly. There was nothing to say anymore. Tina's involvement was clear, and the law was now on her side. As the proceedings continued, Maggie closed her binder slowly, deliberately. She wasn't finished. Not yet. But this chapter was almost closed. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The jury sat at the edge of their seat, and even the defense team to understand that the tide was. The stakes were at their highest. Brian's arrogance had been chipped away, piece by piece, until only the raw, exposed truth. Maggie sat still, her fingers lightly resting on her binder. Her gaze remained steady, though she could feel the weight of the room pressing in. For the first time in weeks, the courtroom felt like the right place. This was where it was meant to be. This was the moment of reckoning. Daniel Rhodes had prepared for this day for months. He'd methodically built his case, layer by layer, until it was a fortress of undeniable evidence. And now, the final key piece to make everything click into place. "Your Honor," Rhodes began, his voice calm but filled with an unspoken resolve, "I call James Harper, Notary Public, to the stand." The courtroom fell into silence as Harper stepped forward. He was a man of few words, but his presence, he didn't look nervous, he looked confident, like someone who knew exactly what needed to be said. Harper raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, before addressing the court. "I am James Harper, and I've been the notary for Margaret Dalton's late husband, Richard Dalton, for over 2 decades. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "The will in question, the one that has been presented, was signed by Richard Dalton 5 months before his death. It was notarized in my presence, and it is legitimate. It is authentic." Rhodes stepped forward with a calm nod. "And where was this will stored?" Harper's gaze remained steady. "It was stored in a lockbox at the Hamilton Savings Bank. The lockbox was opened recently by Mrs. Dalton, and I can confirm that the will found there was the one I notarized." The room was still. The lockbox, the final piece of the puzzle, was now in full view, and with it, all of Brian's claims began to unravel in front of everyone. Rhodes placed a copy of the will onto the evidence. "The will clearly states that the house, all assets, and the estate are to go solely to Mrs. Margaret Dalton. There is no ambiguity. The instructions were clear. Brian Dalton was deliberately excluded." Brian's face, once full of cocky defiance, now seemed to tighten. The color drained from. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, casting nervous glances between his attorney and the documents that had been presented. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't look at Brian. She didn't need to. The truth was hers now. The defense attorney rose, trying to salvage what little was left of his. "Your Honor, we object. There's no way to verify if Mrs. Dalton's signature was coerced. This could be the product of manipulation." Judge Marks, who had been quiet until this moment, cut the defense off with a sharp, firm voice. "Mr. Stanton, the matter of this will is closed. The authenticity has been confirmed. Your client's claims are no longer valid." The courtroom's tension shifted again, this time to Brian. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at his attorney, but there was no escape. The truth had unfolded with such precision that no amount of denial could protect him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rhodes "the will stands. The inheritance is Mrs. Dalton. Brian Dalton's attempts to manipulate his mother's finance, his attempts to exploit her, are not just illegal, they are unforgivable." The defense attorney looked defeated as he slumped back in his chair. The room held its breath, waiting for the judge's final ruling. Judge Marks looked over the documents once more, then turned to the jury. "The evidence presented has made it clear. Brian Dalton is guilty of elder fraud and financial exploitation. Mrs. Dalton's rights are upheld. The defendants, Brian and Tina Dalton will be stripped of their inheritance. Brian's face twisted with disbelief, his jaw tightening as the verdict began to sink in. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The jury stood and began to deliberate, but it was only a formality. The evidence was irrefutable. Brian's fate had already been sealed. The final part of the trial was just a whisper, but it was enough. Holly stepped forward, quietly wiping a tear from her cheek. Maggie, steady as ever, stood and wrapped her arms around her granddaughter. "Grandma," Holly whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Maggie pulled her close, holding her tighter than she had in weeks. There was no victory cry, no dramatic moment, just a steady peace that settled between them both. And then, in the quiet of the courtroom, Maggie was "Not for sale." The door clicked shut behind Maggie with a finality that echoed through the quiet house. The soft creak of the floorboard, the familiar scent of pine and old wood, welcomed her back in a way that felt different now. She stood in the entryway for a moment, taking it all in, her home. The house that had weathered decades of life, now standing as a quiet witness to her victory. Holly, already at the kitchen table, unpacked a small bag, folding clothes neatly. It was a subtle shift. Maggie had long since stopped trying to convince her granddaughter that she didn't need to stay, but the change felt right. Holly had come to help, to stay close, and Maggie, though independent as ever, had welcomed the "I got us some groceries," Holly said without looking up, a smile in her voice. "I figured we could have dinner together tonight." Maggie nodded, watching her with a small, almost imperceptible. The weight of the past weeks had taken its toll, but it was nothing. It was still early afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the window, but the house felt quieter than it ever had. The house where she and Richard had lived for so many years, where they had raised their children, and now, after all the years, Maggie stood alone, stronger, more at peace than she had ever been. There was a knock at the door. It was Martha, her old friend, stepping in with a small bouquet of flowers. "I heard," Martha said, her voice soft but warm. "I thought we could celebrate, just the two of us. A quiet one. You've earned it." Maggie smiled as she accepted the flowers. Martha had always known when to step back and when to step forward. They sat down together at the kitchen table, drinking tea in the late afternoon sunlight, talking about nothing and everything. Rhodes had promised he'd stop by later with the final deed copied, official confirmation that the house was now legally Maggie's, permanently. For now, though, it was just the three, Maggie, Holly, and Martha, sharing a peaceful, well-earned silence. When Rhodes arrived later that day, his presence as steady as ever. "Everything's official," he said, handing Maggie the sealed envelope with the final deed. "You're in the clear, Margaret. No one can touch this property again." Maggie took the envelope with the calm dignity she had worn throughout the entire trial. She didn't feel the need to speak. There was no need. The paperwork, the legal victory, it was all just a confirmation of what she already knew. The house was hers, her future hers to shape, and the world that had once felt heavy and uncertain had fallen away. Rhodes stayed for a while, talking quietly with Holly and Martha about the next steps in Brian and Tina's sentence, offering updates. He was careful not to let the conversation turn too celebratory. The law had done its job, but there was no need to fan the flames of triumph. There was something quieter, something more profound, in knowing that justice had been served. As Rhodes left, he gave Maggie a final, almost fatherly nod. "I'll keep you posted on sentencing, but for now, you've done everything you needed to do." Holly walked him to the door, and when she returned, she found Maggie sitting quietly in the living room, the final deed in her. Maggie placed the papers down on the and stood, walking over to the window that overlooked the backyard. The garden had flourished in the last few weeks. The trees, though still bare in places, had begun to show signs of life again, just like her. She was standing here, in the place she had built with Richard, in the place where her life, her real life, could finally begin again. Holly joined her by the window, her hand finding her grandmother. "We did it," she whispered. Maggie squeezed her hand and then let go. There was a sense of finality, but also of renewal. As she walked to the kitchen, she pulled out her old ledger from the drawer, her quiet companion through the years, and tucked it away. The notebook she had filled with the careful numbers of their life together, the day-to-day detail, was now closed, for good. Her gaze rested on the window again, on the quiet, familiar view of the house and garden. With a small but steady smile, Maggie whispered, "Homestand." The county records office had never been so quiet. Maggie sat at the volunteer desk, The weight of her past and the calmness of the present settled with the smell of old paper and polished wood surrounded her, reminding her of the life she had lived, methodical, orderly, and always steady. But today, something new was pulsing in her veins. It wasn't just about numbers anymore, it was about change. She had never imagined herself in this position, sitting here, in a quiet office, helping others protect what they had worked their entire lives for. But she had been called to this work, just as surely as she had been called to stand up against her son. And so, with each passing day, Maggie found herself becoming a quiet voice of strength for others who needed it. Seniors who came in, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of wills, trusts, and financial planning, found in Maggie a steady hand, someone who could guide them, someone who understood. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts, and Maggie answered with the same calmness she'd carried through every stage of her journey. "County Records," she said, her voice smooth. "How can I help you?" She was now part of the fabric of this place. A woman with a history of loss who had found purpose in that loss. A woman who had once been cornered by her own family, but who had learned to fight not just for herself, but for those who had no one else. As she hung up the phone, the door to the office opened. Holly stepped inside, her smile lighting up. "Grandma, I finished the application," Holly said excitedly, holding up a piece of paper. "I'm applying to law school. I want to help people like you did." Maggie stood up, her heart swelling with pride. She pulled Holly into a tight hug, feeling the young woman's determination radiating through her. "You'll be amazing," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with "You've always had the fire in you." Holly pulled back and grinned, her eyes sparkling with a new sense of purpose. "Thanks to you, Grandma. You've shown me what it means to stand up for what's right." Maggie smiled softly, her hands resting on Holly's shoulders. She had taught her granddaughter so much, but now Holly was teaching her something, and the legacy of strength, of quiet courage, would continue on in the next generation. Later that day, Rhodes stopped by the office, as he had so many times over the past few. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, offering a rare but approving smile. "You know, Margaret," he said, his voice warm, "I've seen a lot of cases, but what you've done, it's something special. Not everyone could have come through that storm the way you did, and now, you're helping others to do the same. It's more than just a case. It's a legacy." Maggie met his gaze, her eyes steady but full of gratitude. "Justice isn't loud," she said quietly, "but it lasts. And when you fight for what's right, it's the truth that speaks the loudest in the end." Rhodes chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Well said." Maggie watched as he left, the sound of the door clicking shut behind him filling the office with silence once again. She turned her attention back to the papers in front of her, the ledger. She opened it, her fingers brushing over the This time, it wasn't filled with the numbers of bills and budget. It was filled with something much more profound, a record of victory, small and large, a chronicle of a woman who had stood up for her and for others. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the records office, Maggie closed the ledger. She tucked it away in the drawer, just as she had so many times before. But this time, there was something different about it. She was done with that chapter. The final page had been written. And so, as the quiet hum of the office surrounded her, Maggie stood and walked over to the window. She looked out at the garden, where the trees had finally begun to bloom again, just as she had. She could feel Richard's presence, not as a weight, but as a companion. The house, the land, the life they had built together. None of it was for sale. It had been hers all along, and now it was hers to protect, not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. With a final glance at the garden outside, Maggie whispered, "Home stands," and with that, she stepped away from the window, the echoes of her past settling gently into the quiet peace of her future.